Dear ladies and gentlemen, glad to welcome the participants of the B20 in St. Petersburg, the first day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. I welcome every opportunity to talk directly to the business community and to talk the issues we are faced with. I'd like to say that the issues we discuss are of great importance, especially given the fact that Russia, just as Mr. Shokhin has just said, in 2 months is going to host, not far from the venue we are holding the summit today, will hold the G20. So a direct engagement with the business community is of great importance to us. Recently, when I was in Moscow, I had the opportunity and the privilege to meet the representatives of the Civil 20. They are analyzing the situation. They also came up with their proposals for the leaders of the G20 countries. And I'd like to tell you that almost all of them echo, in this or that way, the issues that you are posing now and you are dealing with, and your research and your proposals addressed to the G20 countries. The fact that world leaders are concerned with the current developments are quite apparent. The world growth is slowing down. There are not many positive signals. On the contrary, there are many risk factors. Last year was the most complex for the world economy after the 2008-2009 crisis, against the backdrop of increasing debt. The world GDP growth in 2012 accounted, as you know, to 3.2%. In Russia, it was a little bit greater. It was 3.4%. But as for our debt and the debt of other countries, they're all growing, and unfortunately at a great pace. Almost all developed countries, it's 109.3%, whereas last year it was 104%. Before that, it was 120. According to the IMF estimates, the growth is going to continue and is going to stand at 3.3%. We're also concerned about the unemployment rates. You and I know about that. Around 200 million people around the world are unemployed. In certain European countries, unemployment rate stands at more than 25%. The situation is particularly grave in South Africa. Youth unemployment is another source of concern. You know about that. You've probably talked about that when you met. In Portugal and in Italy, unemployment rates among the young people is more than 40%, in Spain more than 50%, in Greece it's more than 60%. It's a tragedy. It's a very dangerous situation, not just for the economy, but also for the social and the political sphere. As for the political sphere, I can tell you that it is a separate issue. Probably it extends over what we're going to talk about at this meeting, but it is something many experts are talking about now. When I was in London at the G8 summit, I met experts from the UK. In an informal format, we had dinner. Many of them are asking themselves, what is the contribution of today's political institutions to the economic crisis, whether they are responsible for that or not.
Business accounts for the large share of investment and jobs in the modern world. It is inevitable, and depending on the confidence of enterprises, the living standard and stability of the whole state depends. That's why I would like to mention that this year G20 agenda includes globally important topics such as infrastructure development, great investment into the human capital, regarding the information presented, everything is quite obvious, because we see that education is of utmost priority. We attach importance to other very important areas. So we work on most of these topics at the official level of the G20. That's why Russia's presidency in this association is striving to pursue an active dialogue with the business community. I mean, you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, ensuring transparency of the working processes of the G20. For that purpose, we hold multilateral consultations with the participation of business circles, and we are willing to fully use the developments and proposals created by you. Today, within the framework of Business Summit, we openly discussed the first draft of your recommendations to the leaders. As I get it, Mr. Shokhin conveyed the Green Book to me, which includes these recommendations. Do you know what it means? The spirits or green snakes or surgeons. So do you know what that means in the Russian language? Well, the picture is quite nice, and these bridges are symbolizing St. Petersburg, and now we have to think how to bring these bridges together. And I'm invoking the problems the global community is facing and the G20 countries are facing, because it is extremely important, and it was mentioned in your recommendations, to remove barriers to investments, trade, because global trade is contracting, and we feel that, as I hope the White Book will be prepared soon, it has been mentioned, including final proposals that would be presented in the G20 summit. This event will take place here. Of course, we will try to take into account everything you are proposing. Let me get back to some of your ideas and proposals after the analysis made by you. And before we proceed with the lively discussions, let me raise a number of questions that could be answered immediately, probably, and they could be serving a basis for our discussions. Financial instruments that are particularly important for economic growth in the nearest future. I would like to raise this question. Many answer that this involves the flexibility of financial regulation. I would like to understand whether this whole includes those people who believe that regulation is not necessary at all. That is a principled question. If there is none who believes that no regulation is needed, it means that a certain enormous transformation or shift has taken place in the perception, the mindset of people present here. And then we have to determine flexible regulation. What does it imply? Where there is a difference between flexible regulation and dictatorship from the regulating authorities. Major principles in trade, that's another question. Follow-up in the field of combating protectionism after 2014. I've got the concrete question to you that has to do with the G20 work. What do you mean? The work within the WTO frameworks, continuation of the discussions within the WTO frameworks, or the extension of temporal agreements achieved before? So, meaning that you are just offering to extend these agreements. It is important because in Los Cabos we were arguing about that. There was an argument between developed and developing economies. The representatives of developed economies said that there is no need to prolong, to extend anything. Why don't you reach final agreements within the WTO? That's what I would like to hear today. It's the question of principle. The next question, what measures are perceived as the most efficient in the fields of job creation? The answer is education, but probably I could agree with it. Now, the next question, what actions should be priority ones in fighting corruption? The answer is transparent state procurement system. Let me inform you that that's one of the problems which we are trying to tackle in Russia in the most efficient way. If you have any concrete recommendations to achieve that transparency, I would be very thankful to you. What are the key factors for promoting private investments in the infrastructure, removing barriers to free inflow of capitals to promote cross-border investments? I'll tell you, and probably you're aware of that one of the key topics discussed in Great Britain within the G8 summit was regulation in the field of tax legislation in the offshoring of the global economy. So the question is whether this removal of barriers to free capital flows will be correlated with de-offshoring and fighting tax evasion. Do you believe that there are certain problems or contradictions in this field or not? I would like to listen to your opinion. If there are, what are they? And the final question, whether you are sure and confident that recommendations will be transferred to real actions. Mr. Shokhin said that 15% are completely confident, and to a certain extent are confident only 60% of respondents. And Mr. Shokhin was a bit skeptic answering that question, making focus on the second part of the second answer, where people are confident to a certain extent. And I would offer to make focus on the first part of the answer, where people are almost confident or completely confident. Thus, the amount of such respondents would amount to 70%. I believe we should be optimistic in that area. Vladimir Vladimirovich, I would want our discussion to involve Alejandro Ramirez, who headed the B20 with the Mexican presidency. It would be of great importance to listen to his opinion as our colleague from G-Troika. Did we manage to ensure continuity in preparing recommendations and take into account new challenges? You mentioned referring to the G8 results.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shokhin. President Putin, thank you very much for your remarks, and thank you also for taking the time to listen to the work carried out by the B20 over the past 6 months. The first thing I'd like to remark is the importance of the dialogue between G20 governments and the international business community represented by the B20 to find common solutions to the challenge of restoring long-term, sustainable and balanced growth, and of continuing this dialogue from one G20 presidency to the next. And in this respect, I would like to commend the Russian B20 Organizing Committee, and particularly Mr. Shokhin, not only for giving continuity to the work of previous B20 summits, but also for laying the foundation of a clearer B20 architecture. During last year's B20, we established 7 thematic task forces, and we introduced an advocacy and impact task force to ensure continuity from one B20 to the next, and impact assessment of B20 recommendations on G20's work. As a result of this, 70% of last year's B20 recommendations were included in the final G20 declaration. It is crucial that through the G20, B20 Dialogue Efficiency Task Force established this year under the Russian presidency, we can track the progress of previous B20 recommendations and G20 commitments. Last year at Los Cabos, the G20 agreed to establish a G20 accountability assessment framework based on the B20's color-coded dashboard. We hope that through your leadership, Mr. President, this accountability mechanism can be brought to life, and through your intervention as chair of the G20, the B20 recommendations are reflected not only in this year's G20 final declaration, but most importantly in the public policies adopted by G20 governments. Thank you once more, Mr. President, for your support of the B20 process, and you can count on the commitment of the international business community to find joint solutions to some of the most pressing global challenges.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I can say that we continued our work in assessing the implementation of recommendations of the G20 and prepared the report that would be presented to you, Mr. President, and to Sherpas. According to this report, the level of implementation of recommendations amounts to 60%. With respect to certain recommendations, we can say that almost 100% of these recommendations have been implemented. With respect to other recommendations, this indicator is a bit lower, but the problem boils down not to the figure, but the content of this work. And since, Vladimir Vladimirovich, since you asked concrete questions, and I saw our colleagues raising their hands to answer those questions, probably we could start answering these questions. The question was about the limits of flexibility in financial regulation. Andrei Kostin and Jim Sterling, dear colleagues, take into account the time limits. Please give brief answers to these questions. Andrei Leonidovich, please, the floor is yours. I believe that not only there are no people who are against regulation, I believe that there are no people who are against Basel III. We believe that Basel III is an additional burden for banks. Having implemented this Basel without any additional steps to strengthen regulation, we could spend 1 year analyzing the behavior of banks, whether they will be involved in loans more or less, and what further steps would be made by them with respect to greater surveillance and regulation. So one example of flexibility. Example about Russia. Central Bank in Russia has a greater reserve ratio with investment credits. Why? Because they're more risky. One story is to interact with enterprises who already exist. They have their own credit history. And the other story is to start everything from scratch. The same holds true of the small business, because there are no pledges for small business. That's why loans are becoming more expensive, because risks are growing. If we want to preserve growth points, if we want to increase jobs and intensify investment projects, flexibility could be aimed at surgical areas, at concrete areas that would be of particular importance. Probably they could enjoy additional benefits. That's, I believe, could be the example of flexibility, so that greater regulation does not impede growth. Mr. Shockin audits all leading banks in Russia, and we have our colleagues who audit banks. Maybe they could add anything.
Senator Kostin had a good example of that. I think at the highest level, our recommendations were about financial regulations, financial inclusion, and financial market infrastructure development. And I'd say the real issue we wrestled with was, in a time in the world as you're looking forward, where changes in macroeconomic policies will be coming into fruition, and we also have new regulations in the banks all around the globe, making sure that the G20 actually look at the intersection of those, both the intended consequences and the unintended consequences, as they pertain to things like the SME sector and the availability of credit. Because at the end of the day, we need jobs, we need growth, and want to make sure that this is all balanced in a very positive way going forward.
Thank you. I would like now to give the floor to Alexei Mordashov to answer. Alexei, sorry, just a couple of words on the first topic. I agree with both my colleagues, with the Russian and the American ones. Let me add the following. First of all, we understand that Russian central bank is a bit concerned with financial regulation, because it is interested in preventing financial bubbles, not to give rise to certain economic areas, products of which will not be in demand in the future. But I would like to draw your attention to the other important aspect, because you've touched upon internal Russian issues, which we will have to address in the future. Russian colleagues know that. Yesterday, I had a a bit informal meeting with the Russian business, and we touched upon this very issue. We discussed bank credits, we discussed supplies, which are quite high in Russia today. But now I would like to draw your attention to a bit different aspect. I agree with you on that part. So what is the different aspect I'm talking about? Interaction with the state between different regions. I've just had a meeting with my colleague, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, small but highly developed, fast-growing European country, one of our largest trade partners. Our trade turnover is higher than $82 billion. Quite an impressive figure. So what is the problem? There are certain rules for the Dutch banks. If, by the way, I failed to tell that to my colleague, nevertheless, I'm going to say it right now. If the Dutch bank invests more than 5% to the Russian economy, the reserve requirements are drastically increased. That's a clear limitation of the investment process. And I'm drawing attention to that fact. Of course, we will discuss it during the G20 summit, but I would want you, dear ladies and gentlemen, during your concrete work, promote your regulating bodies to refrain from such unsubstantiated limitations and restrictions. At our level, we will do everything at stake, but I believe that business community is also interested in preventing these unsubstantiated limitations. They should be eliminated, and I count on your support. Alexei Mordashov, chairman of the Task Force on Trade, the correlation of these standstill obligations till 2014 and finalizing the trade facilitation agreement. Answering your questions, I would like to stress that it is hard to overestimate the importance of trade because it could give significant impetus to the improvement of economic growth against the backdrop of the lack of financial instruments, because financial growth is limited right now due to soaring debts. Trade should exist, it should be efficient and free. And answering your question, I can say that it is important that G20 expresses a clear view with regard to principles to preserve free trade and refrains from introducing additional protectionist barriers. You discussed it in Los Cabos, and reaction was ambiguous. Nevertheless, we would like the G20 leaders to proclaim that we are not going to introduce additional protectionist barriers, irrespective of any pressure domestically. And to make this process more transparent, we believe the G20 should prolong the mandate to monitor protectionist measures, which exists in WTO, OECD, and UNCTAD. That would help monitor this process and make it more efficient in terms of trade protection. We could add additional investment areas to this monitoring process. And I would like to draw your attention to one more aspect, which, as a result of polls, has become even more important for business community. I mean, the trade facilitation agreement that is actively being discussed right now and being prepared within the WTO frameworks. Probably that's the only part of the Doha agenda in terms of global trade liberalization. And I believe this part could be implemented since it is approved of by many. The logic behind it is quite obvious. The Director General of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, said that according to their estimates, global additional expenditures for trade amount to 15%. 5% have to do with tariff costs and 10% with non-tariff measures, measures that should be reduced thanks to the implementation of this trade facilitation agreement. I'm referring to the facilitation of customs procedures, facilitation of cross-border movement of trades and services. It does not cost much, but if we reduce it by twofold, it would equal to full elimination of tariffs. We believe that if G20 leaders have their say in favor of this proposal and they send a signal to the WTO that is important to prepare this agreement for signing in Bali at the ministerial meeting. That would be a significant step towards liberalizing global trade, facilitating global trade, and contributing to growth. This topic is particularly important for Russia. Take into account that in doing business rating, this free trade of services and goods aspect in Russia was taking 162nd place in our country. We've got certain plans to improve this work, and they could complement the implementation of this agreement. I believe that for business it would be particularly important in terms of increasing trade.
In this respect, I'd like to say a couple of words. Removing non-tariff barriers doesn't cost much, of course, but many countries still think that it is going to cost them a high price. It is not very hard to remove those barriers. It's free of charge, but the losses can be great. Well, at least that's the point of view some of the countries assume. Secondly, well, I understand the appeal of the business community, especially the metallurgical companies of Russia, which is represented by Mr. Mordashov. Well, I understand their appeal to move without any boundaries, without being confined. But this is not about us anymore. We should also take into account the interests of other G20 countries. There are countries which deem themselves developing countries. Even at Los Cabos, it was very hard to agree on extending the earlier assumed obligations on protectionist measures. They insisted either on removing those commitments or achieving agreements within the WTO on a long-term basis. And the discussion was very heated, to tell you the truth. We agreed to extend those measures, but now we are faced with this issue again, and unfortunately there has been no positive shift in this field so far. And therefore, I have some sort of a proposal, something I would like to ask you. I would like to ask you to think about the ways you can engage the experts you have in a search for solutions which might be acceptable to everyone. Certainly, it's not good just to talk about the need to remove the barriers. Well, I understand we've got to support our chemical industry, our energy industry, our metallurgical companies. I wouldn't like them to be faced with problems, difficulties, any investigations. What we need is agreements which are acceptable to our partners in other countries, including our partners from developing countries. It is very important to find a balance of interest. Therefore, I would like to ask you, my dear colleagues, as representatives of consulting companies, banks, prominent companies, to engage your experts. Probably could finance their work. It's not going to cost much, just for you. And if those experts could come up with some ideas, recommendations, those recommendations would be of great value to the G20 countries' leaders. I don't know whether we'll be able to do that by September, but we're going to continue our work after September 2013. Mr. President, you've supported our work and investment. Probably I could give the floor to Brent Wilton to say a couple of words about that. He is Secretary General of the International Association of Employers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for your words in recognising within the job crisis the role that education has to play. However, at the same time, I think it's important when we're looking at education, we have to be thinking about what are we going to educate people in? What are the skill sets, what's the knowledge base that these people are going to need for the labour market? And I think in that reason, we need to be linking business closer to the education system to make sure that the outcomes are aligned. We have been doing a lot of work within the B20 task force looking at the issue of education around young people, and we've come up with the L20, the labour group, a joint statement with regards to the principles for apprenticeship, which have now been published and released, which are an attempt again to try and stimulate the engagement of young people and opportunities for training. And we're also working within the IOE and with BIAC on an alliance that will look to commit companies to improving the apprenticeship offering that they make to students. But at the same time, we have to be careful that we are training for employment, and that means there have to be jobs. There are a number of countries in the world where there are a lot of very trained unemployed people. And so it's very, very important for us, and our prime recommendation to the G20 is to make creating business easier. That's the red tape and the bureaucracy around the establishment of businesses. It's about the credit access that has been talked about before. And it's about the right labour legislation and regulation to encourage people to employ. In too many countries in the world now, we're almost like legacy airlines. There are so many rights and protections in place, it's impossible to compete. If you're in a job, you're very lucky. If you want to get a job, you can't. And so we need to make sure that there's a balance between the needs of protection at work, but also the ability and encouragement for business to actually employ. Because it's a huge risk for most small and medium-sized enterprises to take that decision to employ someone. We need to make that as easier a decision as possible. And so there, the appropriate regulation, the role that government can play in incentivizing employment is very, very important. But we need those businesses before we can create those jobs. Thank you.
I'd like to point out once again that creating new jobs is certainly one of the priorities Russia sets forth within the framework of its presidency. I agree with you, we do not just need new jobs, we need jobs which correspond to today's realities. As far as the quality of labor is concerned, as you know, in Russia, the business community has set the task of creating 25 million jobs, not creating them out of thin air. Some of them are going to be reoriented, but still it's an ambitious goal that we've set. But I believe in Russia we can achieve that, especially given the fact that our greatest priority is to modernize the Russian economy. And as this modernization continues, we'll be able to implement the goal that I've talked about earlier. In parallel, we're going to create new jobs, reorient jobs towards the needs of today. But we've got to pay greater attention to this issue at the international level. In this respect, I'd like to emphasize another issue. Several countries, say South Africa, are now facing difficulties in the unemployment field. Russia has programs to retrain people and specialists from developing countries. We are increasing the number of students from developing countries who receive scholarships from the Russian government, and we're going to continue this work going forward. Thank you very much. Mr. President, as for your question on the offshoring, the tax evasion system and removing the barriers in the way of free flow, I'd like to address this issue to Andrei Bugrov, who is head of Anti-Corruption and Transparency Task Force. Thank you. Mr. President, you said that there can be no growth without investment. We have investors whose capital is worth than $5 billion, and it is of great importance. Just as Mr. Mordashev has just said, de-offshoring corresponds to these goals. Very often money goes to offshore zones because the governance is very strict in certain countries, so if we deregulate, then those capitals will stay in the countries. In 2007, the capital flows were worth $12.7 billion. Now they're just $5 trillion. Many insurance companies, especially European insurance companies, complain because additional interest rates prevent them from investing into infrastructure. And to conclude, if we have a broader picture at the free flow of capitals, it is very important to engage private capital, to stimulate private investment into infrastructure, and to create certain standards, as well as use measures, governmental measures to stimulate investment into infrastructure. Who is going to speak on behalf of your task force, Dmitry Evgenich? We didn't talk about the offshore issue specifically, but if someone talks about offshore zones nowadays, it seems as if this is something unpleasant, even though offshore zones have every right to exist. What is important is to ensure an adequate level of transparency with regard to what operations and transactions are processed in those offshore zones. This is a component of the G8. Its initiative was recently discussed, but our task force still has formulated a number of recommendations. We believe that transparency and sunlight are the best disinfectants in the field of fighting tax evasion or any other financial fraud. Offshore zones exist even in Zurich, Luxembourg, New York, London, not just in the Bahamas, for instance. But this is a topic which is not delved into enough. I believe that our colleague is not accurate enough. These issues are discussed. Luxembourg, Zurich, London, those are the issues that were addressed at the G8 summit. Some of them were not reflected in the final documents, but this doesn't mean that they are not on table, nor does it mean that they are not discussed. I'd like to emphasize that the heads of all the countries that met and the G8 summit are in favor of de-offshoring. Well, at least at the first stage they agree with you that sunlight is the best medicine, best cure, and they are all in favor of revealing the ultimate beneficiary. That is our priority, and that is the direction the world is moving, and this is not going to be any differently. So I believe that one way or another we're going to arrive at this point. Even some developed countries believe that they suffer, their tax system suffer from the existence of offshore zones. Even the economy of the United States of America, President Obama talked about his proposal and his initiatives. He told us a little bit about the initiatives the U.S. has assumed. We can have a look at what the U.S. is doing in this field. Say they've introduced a requirement to pay this gap between the interest rate which exists in the U.S. and the interest rate the companies cover in offshore zones. There are different mechanisms that exist, but anyway, that is the direction the world economy is taking. Mr. President, you've also proposed that we adjust the methodology so that the business community could be more confident that the recommendations will be translated into concrete decisions. So I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Courier. Probably he could give us a brief comment on this issue.
With Alexander Shokin as a co-director of the task force, we've been basically looking at some continuity in this process of the G20 and the B20 recommendations to G20 governments. We've moved over the years from Seoul in South Korea to Mexico, before that France, and now to Russia, and we'll be moving on to host by Australia next year. And for business, it is for us important to be able to concentrate the kinds of proposals that we are advancing to governments. Important in the sense of having them well understood, and important in terms of sustaining the insistence that these are proposals which will work for the global economy. So that is part of the exercise that we've been going through with our colleagues. The other aspect of this is very much, I think, a joint effort of business and governments. We are engaged in trying to advance constructive ideas to G20 governments, which we believe are good for those governments and for the world economy in general. But we necessarily, I think, being business people, want to have some measure of whether or not, first of all, these measures are being listened to and taken up by governments, and to what point they are being implemented. And I think we will go beyond that to say, in fact, are they working? And do we want to adjust the kinds of proposals that we want to make? So we want to, in this exercise, this task force, to be able to become more efficient in terms of making useful proposals to governments, more efficient in terms of measuring and reporting to governments on whether or not and to what degree they are taking them up and implementing them, and also ourselves evaluating the effects of what's happening with this. So I think this is a summary, really, of what this task force has been about, which looks to have some continuity over time.
Я, знаете, сразу могу сказать, как мы будем с этим работать.
You know, I can tell you straight away what we're going to do.
Могу сразу сказать, как мы будем с этим работать.
I can tell you right away what we're going to do. Having received recommendations from you, we're going to give the relevant instructions to the Russian Sherpas who are, I believe, present here and who listen to what we have to say. They're going to process those issues. They're going to talk them through with their colleagues from the G20 countries and will translate the recommendations that you've given to us to practical dimension so that we could understand to what degree they're going to be reflected in the G20 final documents. So far, I can tell you anything or promise you anything because this is something we're going to discuss with our colleagues from the G20. But in this, or in one way or another, we're going to incorporate your proposals in the final documents. I have another issue. Unfortunately, Mr. Shokhin missed it. That is innovative development as a global priority. I have a question addressed to you, dear ladies and gentlemen. This is an issue our society is discussing. We have several draft laws submitted to the Russian government with regard to protecting titles to intellectual property. What is your attitude towards the freedom of disseminating information in social networks, on the internet? And how does it, according to your opinion, correlate to protecting intellectual property? Victor Vekselberg, as responsible for this issue, probably could talk about that a little bit. Yes, I'm very interested in your opinion. You can start, and your colleagues from abroad could probably add something to what you have to say. As a matter of fact, within the framework of the innovation task force, we've come to an agreement that the intellectual property legislation is an objective factor which stimulates the emergence of new technological advances and the development of the world economy in general. So far, we can tell you that there is a certain gap between the developing countries and the developed countries. Therefore, there is a need to harmonize the legal space so that we could ensure single forum for promoting and protecting intellectual property rights. On the other hand, the situation that we're witnessing today is advantageous to the large corporations and international companies and the developed countries, because there is a large technological gap between the developed countries and developing countries, and it is only growing. So we would like to propose several norms, several regulatory norms, say in the field of anti-monopoly legislation, which could give the developing countries a chance to keep up, not to fall behind, without, however, discriminating against the developed countries, and which would not create any obstacles in the way of technological advancement. As for the internet and protecting intellectual property rights and social networks and the internet, we did have a discussion on that issue, and our position is the following. We believe that openness and universal access to information networks are a prerequisite for promoting democracy, for stability of all economic systems. Therefore, introducing any artificial ban or limitation of disseminating information is going to be an obstacle in the way of development, so we've got to be very careful with that. But that is my personal opinion. Probably my colleagues will add something. I'm afraid this is not the full answer. What is your attitude towards the freedom? Because you can easily find an instruction on how to create a nuclear bomb or how to commit a suicide on the internet. You can find everything there. And there are films, animated films, for instance, disseminated in the internet, but there are people or companies that have intellectual property rights to that. So disseminating information on the internet prevents them from receiving their royalties. It prevents them from creating new works of art. That is what we're interested in.
There is a big difference between regulating copyrights in the and intellectual property rights in innovations and life of our civil societies and access of certain information to the public domain. Well, Vector, it is very easy. Edison invented something and he got money for that. Someone wrote a song and his relatives keep receiving revenues. And it all could be spread in the internet and nobody will get even $1 because nobody will pay for it. Thus, you could use any information in the internet. So what is this difference? How can we differentiate between freedom of information and protecting intellectual property legitimately? Well, that's what I'm talking about. We need to create mechanisms to regulate the rights to spread information by the entities that have no right for that. So, do you agree with that? Yes, of course. Anybody else willing to say something? Maybe somebody from your task force? Paul Stoffel, maybe?
If I can speak about the energy side, Mr. President, we have been advocating a freer market to guide us into the huge investments which are requested in the industry in the energy side to, first of all, give free access to everybody on the planet. Today, there are 1.3 billion of people that have no access whatsoever to any energy. There is a 2.6 billion people that actually have low-level access to energy, and this will require $1 trillion of investment in the next 15 years, and therefore we need a guidance from the market, a liberalized market, to generate those cash flows that will be needed to invest. The second point we raised and we recommend relates to the reliability of our energy. The quality of the energy comes from the technology mix, the innovation in the development of new techniques which will generate electricity out of other forms of natural resources, renewables, a greener type of approach, which will be coupled with the continuation of the existing framework of fossil fuels and nuclear capacity. In particular, some reference has been made to continued use of the gas availability, some opening to the shale gas techniques that will provoke other countries to be able to generate gas and use that gas proficiently to generate electricity. This in terms of reliability, then the key question was a balanced approach to generation mix and to distribution technologies that will allow energy to be disseminated in many different places. And then the other point was sustainability, the ability to be able to generate electricity without pollution, without emission, to be able to fight the climate change and be able to support a cheaper energy at the end of the day. So balancing the three parameters in a new paradigm where consumer can choose from the energy he wants to consume, having sustainable, cheaper, and reliable energy is our recommendation. And in terms of that, free market, no subsidies, allowing the cost related to price being free without any maneuvering, any subsidization of the energy sector. And finally, the ability to promote those technologies that are at the very stage of the inception in research and development, which will allow for the future to be able to grow. That's the recommendation for.
Well, I believe that I have nothing to add here. I would agree almost with everything. But I would also highlight that nobody should create additional problems and difficulties in this area, which is extremely important. We need stability of decisions made and existing regulatory frameworks. We should be based on fundamental rules, including the rule that has no retroaction. Everything that is decided today should be valid as of today and for the future, and should not have any reference to the past. Otherwise, we destabilize the situation, and in the energy sector, it is particularly dangerous. We always argue or interact with our European partners who are implementing the third energy package. They adopted it after our companies had signed long-term contracts to supply energy sources. And now they are trying to apply their rule to the contracts that had been signed before. We believe that it is not correct and it does not coincide with the modern rules of the game. I believe that the solutions to this problem would be found. It is important because invest tens or hundreds of billions of dollars into the infrastructure projects, and after that we fail to use the infrastructure we all talk about and we all want to develop due to decisions made afterwards. I believe it is counterproductive completely. And we should take that into account now and in the future. There is one colleague over there who wanted to say a couple of words. Please have a floor.
Back to IP, for the technology in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, it's essential that there are patents, because the investment in this field before you get to a product is 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years, and therefore protecting an invention in order to release billions of dollars in those investments for new products is very critical. And that needs to be a global accepted policy and a global accepted way of working to enable large international companies also to invest in this country and invest in other countries. Patents are essential for us to invest in technology and in the future of research and development.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, now I would like to give the floor to Richard Gordo, who will assume presidency of G20 from the 1st of December this year. We really hope that a lot that has been touched upon today will be understood by our Australian colleagues in the field of business and other areas, even though the presidency will change soon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shokin, very much, and thank you, President Putin, for your support and engagement with this group. As the new member of the Troika and CEO of a large Australian business, I'm the new boy in this process, but I'm very, very appreciative of, Mr. Shokin, your engagement with Australia and support for us next year. Can I congratulate you, Mr. Shokin, and Mr. Praxon, your task force leaders, your National Steering Committee, and all task force participants on the work that you've done, the way you've done it in a very inclusive manner. And can I endorse the recommendations of the task forces. President Putin, can I wish you good luck in your leadership of the G20 meeting in St. Petersburg in September. This beautiful city with a great history but also wonderful energy at the moment is a great setting for that meeting. And of course, the more successful you and your colleagues are this year, the less work we'll have to do next year. So I wish you good luck and making real progress in the creation of growth and jobs. And can I also say that I think it's incredibly important that business commits to doing its bit, that this is a mutual thing. This is not business looking to government to solve its issues, that it's business working with government and making commitments with government to deal with growth and jobs. And I'm sure business leaders from each of the G20 countries will go from this summit and endorse and lobby the recommendations as they come out of the White Book of their political leaders to hopefully make some real progress in September. And let me finish, Mr. Shokin, just by saying next year we're looking forward to working with all G20 members, particularly with you and with our counterparts from Turkey, to ensure that this process, the B20 and G20 process in Australia, continues the very good work you've done. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, probably we received much more time than we counted for from our, and we achieved much more than expected from our work with Mr. Putin, and the process of working with recommendations put forward by Mr. Putin will help us if we do our homework to achieve great success. Unfortunately, we failed to find answers to all the questions raised. A lot of work is to be done, and after that we'll have to combine the priorities of the G8 put forth by the Russian president on de-offshoring, on disclosing information on final beneficiaries, on giving this information to taxpayers. We need to formulate our approaches on all these issues, including the intellectual property rights and many other issues that are on the agenda. Nevertheless, we see that the president of the G20 is ready to promote our recommendations and present them to the colleagues from G20, take into account that these recommendations are taken by consensus. A lot depends on you. You should work with your leaders from your capitals to convince them to take into account these recommendations. And now I would like to thank Vladimir Vladimirovich for participation in discussing these very important topics. And since summit is the ultimate point of the G20, I believe a lot is to be done after September, when we transfer our priorities to our Australian colleagues and to work on implementing to the full the recommendations in the future. Thank you. Just one word, sorry. We'll have time to applaud. Before we part, a couple of words I would like to tell you. You know, our meetings have turned into the working meetings, because the working atmosphere is created. But I would like to draw your attention to the following. We've gone through the crisis of 2008, 2010, and 2009 and 2010. The situation in the global economy is fraught with risks, uncertainty, factors. And of course, we all hope that the best-case scenario will be implemented, but we do not know for 100% how the situation will develop. We really hope that all negative events we faced in the previous years were the worst part of the story, and let's hope that we will move towards the upward spiral. But we don't know whether it will happen for sure. That would be dangerous to exacerbate the current situation, but it is also dangerous to underestimate the problems we might face in the future. We can discuss anything. We can say that this crisis has long been due to take place, and the Soviet markets in collapse was also a logical development due to the collapse of the USSR. We can say that now markets cannot fulfill the needs of the developing countries. We can say that current political systems are not capable of addressing the aspirations of their citizens. There are too many questions and there are less answers than we would want to have. We were speaking about the difficulties in the global economy. One of the most alarming indicators is the high unemployment rate. In European countries with developed economies, this unemployment level amounts to 40, 50, or even 60%. You know that in our country, unemployment level accounts for 5.5%, which is unprecedentedly low for our country. Last year, our GDP grew by 3.4%. That's the global level. This year, this indicator will be a bit lower, and IMF forecasts our growth that is equal to the global growth, because they're a bit too optimistic about our economic growth. We've got the minimum of inflation, and we continue to decrease this level. We've got the minimum debt, because foreign debt of Russia amounts to 2.5%, especially if we compare this to 100% of debt in the United States and 100% or more in European countries. There's an enormous difference. On the whole, the European economy and Russian economy shows good signs. Nevertheless, we are very concerned about current situation. If the whole world is to protract and subtract, our economy will inevitably face the same consequences. That is why only thanks to joint efforts we will be able to find efficient ways out of this complex situation. It would be extremely dangerous if, against the backdrop of the complexity of issues we are facing, will be limited to national borders. It is very hard to avoid such a situation, but thanks to joint efforts between the government and business community, we'll be able to solve this problem, and your shoulders will be bearing an enormous responsibility, and I hope that we'll continue this positive joint work in the next years. Thank you very much for your participation.